Welcome everyone to Choosing Formats for Accessible eBooks and e-journals. My name is MoChridhe. I'm the Scholarly Communication Coordinator at ATLA, and I work primarily with ATLA Open Press, an open access publisher of both books and journals at the intersection of librarianship and theology and the study of religion. I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the choices we recently faced in determining what the best digital output formats for our readers would be for our different publications. I'll be presenting some of the background to the options that we had, some of the key factors in our decisions, the choices that we made, and the preliminary indications that we have of benefits from them, and touching briefly on a couple of the challenges of implementation for any library publisher or other publisher interested in going down some of those same roads. So as a bit of background, our standard go-to file format to provide no matter what has always been PDF, and this webcomic from XKCD does a good job of showing why. Nothing really beats PDF for ensuring that everyone will be able to open your document and see it as you intended until the end of time. It's become an industry standard for that reason, and it's indispensable for those of our publications that do have print runs in working with the printer. They want everything in PDF. So there's never been any question that we're going to provide that. We've long been aware, though, that there are limitations to PDF as a format. It's really print-centered rather than digitally focused. And one of the key limitations we've been running up against as we've looked at how we can better meet some of the gold standards in the library and open publishing communities is with accessibility. You'll see the phrase accessible PDF, but accessibility, there's a wide range of meanings to that term. And what you can do with a PDF, even trying to maximize its accessibility, still really isn't getting you to the same kind of gold standard places that you can get with other more digitally oriented file formats. So we knew that we needed something beyond that, and for a long time what we've provided beyond that is EPUBs. EPUBs are familiar to users of ebook readers. They're very familiar to everyone in the accessibility community. They've long been a standard format for producing books in digital form. We've been providing them for serials as well, simply because we wanted to make sure that we had something to provide accessibility for our readers. As we learned more, though, we came to realize that we weren't doing as much good there as we thought we were. And I think a lot of library publishers perhaps make the same mistake that we did. You think, oh, well, I want something that's accessible. EPUBs are accessible. I also want something that will preserve a lot of very finicky layout and formatting in this document. Fixed layout EPUB. But it turns out fixed layout EPUB, like PDF, has some of the same challenges and also really isn't meeting the accessibility benchmarks that we wanted to be hitting. It also wasn't providing the benefits that a digitally focused, digitally native format really should in terms of reflowing text to size on different devices. Readership on mobile devices is increasing all the time, and it's very important to be cognizant of and out ahead of that trend. So we knew that we needed to re-examine this. And there were questions about, well, do we switch to a different format? Do we just kind of reinvest in producing reflowable EPUBs and figuring out how to meet some of the technical challenges that would introduce for our workflow? And as part of this discussion, we also had our eyes on a journal, the Journal of Teaching. You see it at the bottom there, which we host, but is produced by partners of ours at the Wabash Center. Their first several issues offered HTML alongside both these formats. And every time we ran statistics, we saw these usage numbers and thought, wow, that's a lot of people reading the Journal of Teaching by HTML. Is that something that we should be considering? Because it's not something we'd offered for our own publications. So these became our options: EPUBs in some format or a switch to HTML. We were also aware of XML first publishing workflows, but those are really more behind the scenes. In the end, you deliver your readers HTML, EPUB, PDF out of that XML based workflow. So I'll mention those briefly again in implementation, but in terms of our immediate question, what do we serve up to readers? We knew we were keeping PDFs. The question was EPUBs or HTML, some combination of the two, we're not sure. And as we looked around for answers to this question, we found a lot online about why PDFs aren't enough and you should have one of these like digitally optimized formats for e-reading. But when we then ask the question, okay, we're sold on that idea, which format should we use and for what? We didn't find a lot of information. So we're hoping to contribute back to the community a little bit here from our experience in trying to answer this question. Some of the factors we looked at, accessibility obviously was our starting point. It turns out, though, that EPUBs are a kind of a container, and what's inside the container is a lot of the same technology that drives websites, including HTML. So every EPUB file is built on HTML, and what that meant for us was that although the pathways are a little bit different in terms of how you lay out workflows for this, they can both get to that same place in terms of accessibility. So serving up direct HTML5 on our website, just like you were looking at a web page, versus bundling it in an EPUB file to be used with your EPUB reader. As long as we used reflowable EPUBs, then we would be able to achieve the same targets there. So on that point, these two were pretty much equivalent. For portability, though, there's obviously a big difference. Those packaged EPUB files are easy to store and transmit and download as a single package, and especially if you're going to be reading offline or have a need to read on dedicated e-reader devices, that portability matters a great deal. Web formatted HTML CSS delivered in the browser can be bundled and read offline. That process is a lot less standardized and intuitive. So where you need to ingest directly into library collections with a clean single file for a repository, for example, or where you're envisioning extensive offline use, EPUB is often a better way to go. We also found, though, that plain HTML5 right in the browser, just like a web page, can be displayed in any standard browser with relatively uniform results, whereas EPUBs require special software and plugins, and depending on which software your user is using, you can get a very different display. So where we needed detailed control over final layout, or where we knew that our readers needed to access content without specialized equipment or without the necessity for passing files through firewalls, etc., HTML5 opened up a lot more opportunity in those cases. Another point of difference was DRM. We're an open access publisher. We don't DRM any of our outputs, so it wasn't a factor for our consideration. But publishers that do use DRM should be aware that EPUBs support those in varying forms, whereas that's not something you can do with HTML files beyond just putting them behind a login on your website. So as we summarized all this, we found that EPUB's advantages really lay where large, complex documents were engaged by users as single items, and where extensive amounts of reading were likely to occur offline or through e-readers. Monographs obviously suggested themselves as such a case. But where content was generally accessed modularly in smaller pieces and largely read online, as with our journals, we decided that plain HTML5 right in the browser could offer greater convenience and a more consistent reading experience for our readers. So, as you have probably guessed, we decided to retain EPUB3 for our books program, but making that change from fixed layout to reflowable EPUBs for accessibility and greater device neutrality, while moving our serials publications to a pairing of PDF and direct HTML. This is a pretty new change. The first of our publications to do this was the Theology Cataloging Bulletin back in January. The most recent issue of Theological Librarianship has become the second to do this, and that, as of the time of this recording, came out a little over a week ago. So these numbers are still pretty preliminary, especially for them. But what we see is a very clear increase in use of digital-oriented formats when we offer the HTML over the EPUB. Usage of HTML is about 3 times greater in the case of the Theology Cataloging Bulletin than readership of EPUBs was, and it's a little more than twice as much for Theological Librarianship. So a limitation of this study is that we don't have qualitative feedback data like from reader surveys. That's something we need to look for coming up. But right now, these numbers do seem to confirm that we were achieving what we set out to in the first place, which is through HTML to offer our journal readers a more consistent, convenient, and device-neutral reading experience for articles, while that PDF, which we still have there, is preserving the portability and pagination of records, so those two formats can complement each other and supply some of each other's deficiencies. Meanwhile, books still have EPUBs for the advantages pertaining to that longer format, and we are transitioning those for accessibility purposes, primarily to reflowable rather than fixed layout. Implementation challenges can be a whole presentation of their own. There's just a couple points I want to highlight here. One is about standards. There's two kind of sets of key guidelines here. One is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which were built originally for websites and really are the gold standard for your HTML files. And on top of that, there layers the EPUB Accessibility 1.0 guidelines. It's an extension of those same guidelines for HTML, but covering some of the factors unique to that EPUB container format. The nice thing about this is that it allows us to build in a couple of stages as we're learning how to do accessibility better in our workflow and our outputs, because we can focus first on that HTML standard and get that right in our journal galleys and use that kind of as a proving ground for everything that we're going to need to do for books also, knowing that all that same work and expertise we're developing there will transfer to meeting those EPUB requirements. We, of course, have some changes to make to our workflow. Moving into these formats allows us to hit our accessibility targets, but it doesn't do that for us. We still need to make sure that the files that we're outputting in these formats are meeting standards, and that means changes all through our process. One thing I'll point out here is that the switch to HTML has proved to be a little bit more time consuming than simply hitting File Export in InDesign to produce those EPUBs. We export the HTML from InDesign, and that part's very easy, but there is a little bit of manual remediation to fit that neatly into the layout and format of our website. And this is where we come back to those XML-based workflows I mentioned before. They give the same outputs, but behind the scenes they can make it easier to achieve those outputs. So we're very interested in the possibility that an XML-based workflow might allow us to generate all three of these formats more easily with a lot less manual intervention out of a single workflow. That's something we're exploring for the future, but for now we've just focused on HTML and EPUB outputs and really refining those for our readers. I also just briefly want to plug for the ACE Checker software from the DAISY Consortium. They're a big player in the EPUB accessibility space. They provide the ACE Checker for free on their website, and it's really an indispensable tool for doing auditing and review of really a number of file formats, but particularly for the EPUBs that you're generating. I cannot say enough in favor of the time it will save you and the ease that it provides in tracking down where some of the gaps in your accessibility coverage might be right now. So that's a little bit about our experience and some of the answers that we found to these questions. If you have any questions now, I'm very happy to take those. Or if you think of others down the road as your own programs are working through some of these issues, always feel free to email me or hit me up on Twitter. I love to talk digital publishing. And thank you very much.